Yo, welcome to another episode of Simply Bitcoin IRL. Today we have a very special guest. We have Mark Goodwin, editor-in-chief at Bitcoin Magazine. Absolutely love the guys over at Bitcoin Magazine. They're crushing it. Those are some of the best conferences in the world. I'm really excited for today's episode. We have so much to dive into. Mark has made quite a bit of a splash in a recent episode that he did with Whitney Webb, and just people have seemed to have received it really well. So we're going to explore some of those topics. But before we jump into the show, I do want to give a very special shout out to the Bitcoin company that powers Simply Bitcoin IRL. And of course, I'm talking about Bitcoin Well. Bitcoin Well is the best place to build your automatic self-custody Bitcoin stack. Future-proof your money by using a Bitcoin on-ramp that is self-custody by default. What does that mean? That means that you can't buy Bitcoin on Bitcoin Well unless you're going to take self-custody, which perfectly aligns with the Simply Bitcoin ethos of the separation of money and state. Because after all, Bitcoin in self-custody in cold storage is the revolution. Head over to bitcoinwell.com/simply and support Bitcoin self-custody by default Bitcoin on-ramps. All right, everybody, no more delay. We want to bring up Mark on stage. How you doing, Mark? What's up, bro? I don't think we've ever chatted before, so I'm excited for this.
Yeah, man, Nico, thanks for having me, brother. I don't think we ever are, certainly not on the show, but I think we crossed paths in Pack Bitcoin a couple of years ago as FTX was imploding. I think we crossed paths there, but yeah, man, super happy to be here. Love the show, love Opti, love what you guys do, and stoked to be here.
Appreciate it. Pack Bitcoin. Yeah. So that's probably why I don't remember, because I literally just was running around like a crazy person at 23. So much things going on, running the stream, panels, MC, just nuts. As like, it was all a big blur. Anyways,
yeah,
bro, you're like super famous now. You did this epic, this epic interview, like I was saying in the intro. And you covered all these crazy topics. I think a lot of people, when like podcasts really blow up, I think it's because it resonates with a lot of people. Like it connects with a lot of people's, it hits people's heartstrings. But it's obviously you've hit on topics that I think maybe perhaps people weren't aware of. So I'm gonna rip the Band-Aid straight off and just jump straight into it. What is Tokenization Inc? And this is something that like Larry Fink has brought up. I've seen him talk about this on Legacy Corporate Media. What is that?
Yeah, totally. Let's jump right in. I mean, basically, I wrote this piece with my friend Whitney Webb about, kind of this concerning rhetoric that I was seeing from our boy Lawrence Fink, the CEO of BlackRock. As BlackRock is getting ready to embrace Bitcoin in a really big way with, their IBIT or iShares Bitcoin Trust, their ETF, their spot ETF, which now has like 400,000 Bitcoin or something insane, right? But this was back around the approval, so like the beginning of January, and Larry's getting up there and he's talking about how he basically, the framework that BlackRock is looking at Bitcoin. And, something really struck me. I mean, literally it was, I was writing out these quotes in real time as I was watching him talk. I think it was on CNBC. I'm not exactly sure which one was the first interview, but he did a couple interviews like, right around the 11th of January when the ETFs were approved. And in one of them, he literally said, if we can ETF a Bitcoin, what else can we ETF? And I definitely saw this as kind of this, like, first off, he's like inventing a new verb, right? Like ETFing. And I saw it as kind of this like arrogant kind of like, hey, look what we're doing with Bitcoin. If we can reduce, all of the, ridiculousness that, the Bitcoin network goes through to like, have decentralized consensus, and a distributed network. If we can reduce all of that to, a QSIP ticker that's traded on the New York Stock Exchange, what else can we, reduce to an ETF? And I saw it as kind of this, like, I like to I like to listen to what the baddies say and then also look at their actions. And oftentimes they're not aligned. But I think in this case, this one kind of worried me a bit. And I was like, oh my God, like Bitcoiners are rolling out the red carpet here for Larry, and they're so excited about this ETF, like so many, not everybody, but a lot. And here he is basically, mocking us, saying he's, he ETF'd to Bitcoin, right? And so I think people kind of just like forgot who Larry kind of is and what BlackRock is, and maybe what Wall Street, these huge institutions, like what their kind of plan is for Bitcoin. So I started kind of digging into Larry and BlackRock, and I found a lot of stuff that, I knew he was a baddie, but I didn't really realize how connected he was to the public sector in such this way. And so the piece kind of became a look at the private public, paradigm, and this, ability for these huge institutional players, that have benefited so much from the debasement of currency, of saving mechanisms for the, the working class, and have, really like taken advantage of arguably these private sector caused and public sector exacerbated, financial crises. And BlackRock was a huge part of 2008, huge part of 2020. Actually, BlackRock bought the iShares brand from Barclays in the 2008 crisis, after Barclays sort of denied a bailout from the UK government. BlackRock came in, bought iShares. They didn't have any ETF products before. And now it's, one of the biggest parts of their entire operation. And ETFs are kind of like the most traded, vehicle right now. But anyways, yeah, kind of was just like seeing what Larry was saying about Bitcoin. And so that ETF of Bitcoin scared the shit out of me. And then he said a couple other things that were really crazy. Specifically saying, I don't believe Bitcoin is ever going to be a currency. I believe it's an asset class. And then he said that he called it a technology for asset storage, which I think is really interesting, especially when you look at, kind of the, maybe you could argue the distraction, but the debate going on now in Bitcoin culture, which I'm hoping we kind of move on from because I'm kind of sick and tired of it. Been doing it for so long, but with like the ordinal stuff and Bitcoin as a database and all this. But he's coming out here saying, I don't want it to be a currency. We want an ETF of Bitcoin. It's an asset class. And we look at the ledger, this universal ledger, as being something that we can uphold digital IDs with, we can uphold tokenized assets, and basically saying that tokenization is sort of the next ETFing. And when you begin to look at the history of Larry and BlackRock and all of their ESG plays and their connections with the natural asset corporations and all of this stuff, you start to see this kind of ghoulish picture of, what Larry and BlackRock, are kind of planning to hopefully do with Bitcoin. And wanted to just kind of get the story out there, remind people who Larry is, and sort of raise a little bit of hell about, hey, there's like a concerted effort here to basically label Bitcoin as an asset class, as a commodity, and not as this peer-to-peer, medium of exchange. And I do think that, thinkers like Beauty On and are correct in labeling Bitcoin as, a database and not as money in the legal sense. And I agree with that. It's speech, it's code. But in terms of like the way I hope users sort of look at it, Bitcoin really should be upheld as this peer-to-peer thing. And the further we get from that, the more we go into this unit of account, store of value commodity class rather than this peer-to-peer currency. I think we lose a lot of the power that Bitcoin really gives us as being this thing that circumnavigates the state and trusted third parties and all that. And if we lose that and it just becomes another QSIP, another ticker, another paperized asset like gold, I think it really defangs a lot of the beauty of Bitcoin and the power of Bitcoin, and it plays right into this financial class. And it can actually be a tool that, not just empowers, the unbanked global self citizen, but also, empowers the state. So, that's kind of the general idea for why, we worked on this piece, why we did this piece. Yeah, I think the idea sort of resonated with people because, I mean, they just literally say it. I mean, it's pretty wild. I mean, these are just, this isn't really like, an extrapolation, or some kind of like schizo theory here. I mean, these are just kind of things. These are just direct quotes, really, from Larry. And you go to look at his history, and this is kind of the stuff he's done from the get go, right? So yeah, that's kind of a little overview of the story here. But yeah, Tokenized Inc. piece for Bitcoin Magazine that I wrote with Whitney Webb. We co-posted it on a limited hangout as well, which is her site. Yeah, we've been kind of working in that realm for a bit now. We've done 3 pieces now since, basically Christmas. And all of them have kind of been looking at sort of the dollar system players that are now kind of encroaching into Bitcoin and using Bitcoin, and, and some other pieces, side chains of Bitcoin, but using Bitcoin as this asset storage and using this technology that's apparent in blockchain to basically tokenize the natural world. And that's something that I think Larry wants to do. And now he's sort of proven that he can tokenize Bitcoin, reduce it to this QSIP. And now he's going to move on to other things. They have to find a way basically to service this debt of the U.S. government. And how do they do that? They've basically reversed the old oil baron mechanism of digging in the ground for oil, and now they're debt barons, and now they're digging holes, not looking for assets, but looking for places to shove debt, dollar denominated debt. So here they are looking to the natural world, looking to green finance, looking to carbon credit that they can denominate with private issued stable coins and basically blow out the treasury by tokenizing the real world. This is a trend that we're seeing. When we wrote this article, BlackRock hadn't even really started yet, and now they have this huge USDC fund on Ethereum. It's called the BUIDL, like BUIDL fund, and they're working on securitizing, tokenizing, real world assets on Ethereum, basically using USDC, which is pretty much exactly what we spelled out in this article, and now we're kind of seeing it. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And I think Bitcoiners should be a little concerned about this. Larry's not a good guy. But that's kind of basically the overview there. I know I've ranted for like 10 minutes now, but that's sort of the idea. Yeah.
And it was amazing rant. I kind of wish you kept going.
Oh shit.
But no, but I have so many questions for you. Okay. So Larry Fink's not a good guy. Sure. BlackRock has a plan. You're saying to they essentially want to capture this. They want to tokenize it, like you said. Do you think that has anything to do with the U.S. government, the kind of the regulatory situation currently in the States, where like you can see it happening in slow motion? Like, for example, today Cynthia Lummis basically tried to tweet out and say, like, look, they're basically going after self-custody. It's not legislation, traditional legislation. It's like legislation through enforcement. Do you think it's interconnected?
Oh yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, I'm, I'd like to think I'm based in logic and in the real world, but I'm at this point, I'd say I'm a pretty full blown, that there is sort of a conspiracy with the regulatory arm and the governing body, the public sector of the United States, to embrace Bitcoin as a method of, basically extending the economic hegemon that is the U.S. dollar system, using this sort of demand inelastic energy commodity. So I wrote a book called The Bitcoin Dollar. The Bitcoin dollar being this, it's kind of an analog to the petrodollar. So it's not a literal monopoly on the ins and outs of, buying an energy commodity, but just like the petrodollar, it's basically, hey, you want to industrialize and buy oil, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. you want to industrialize and buy oil, you got to buy dollars first. So what that does is it kind of increases demands inorganically for dollars because people want this thing that they've basically done a de facto monopoly on the ins and outs of, and they've dollar denominated it. So anybody in Asia, they want to buy oil from the Middle East, they got to buy dollars first. They've basically created the same mechanism for Bitcoin. All 99% basically, certainly 97 plus percent of like volume in the Bitcoin market is US dollar denominated, and a huge amount of that is now in stable coins, but US dollars in general, and these heavily regulated on and off ramps are dollar denominated. And so oil and Bitcoin are actually kind of similar in a lot of ways as sort of this energy based commodity. Despite my wanting it to be more of a currency, like there is an absolute argument to be made that analog is sort of there. And so I think that the dollar regime has basically proven that they'll do whatever they need to do to keep the dollarization of the world growing. And a way to keep servicing their debt. And I think that they've kind of found this method with Bitcoin. And I think when you look at the regulatory stuff that's happening right now, it is a push away towards self-custody. And it's a push towards these like highly regulated instruments like an ETF. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. They're going to make it really difficult to kind of run and write code, most likely in the United States. And have a push towards these highly regulated instruments like ETFs. That's what Larry wants, and I think it's not a coincidence. There's a white pill in here, right? Where why did this happen 5 days after? Why did the samurai arrest happen? A few days after the halving. Why is the Bitcoin economic policy like that important? Where having a relative issuance, now below gold coming out of the ground, below like 1% relative issuance. I think that there's a signpost there that this economic policy is really important, that these things are being timed up. And this was something that I wrote, at the end of 2021 when I did my first piece on the Bitcoin dollar, when I first introduced this analog to the petrodollar. I made a claim basically that the petrodollar died in March 2020 when we saw that quote unquote COVID low. We saw oil go negative, in the futures markets, and we saw Bitcoin drop to $3,500. And then a year later, it 20x'd by the end of the next year. But why was that moment so important? Well, obviously it was COVID, right? But now we've kind of learned a bit more about COVID, where, depending on which level you're looking at it, even if you're really going with, the mainstream story here, still it was, it was arguably, funded, this gain of function research funded by the U.S. government, hits off in Wuhan around then. And there's mass coordinated global shutdowns, world empire context, mass shutdowns, the same policies in Russia as in Ukraine, as in Israel, as in the United States, as in Canada. Everywhere just did the exact same thing. It's kind of world empire context. And that's 6 weeks before the third halving. And the third halving, of course, I think was sort of the most important halving in a lot of ways, because it was the first time that the rate of issuance relative to total supply was below 2%. When we went down to 3 and change. So that's the first time it's below the dollar, the target rate of inflation of the dollar. So there's not really, I think it would be kind of insane to think that there wasn't some, thinking there by maybe some of these powers that be that, hey, the US dollar now is it's kind of economically toast. And what did we see over the next year, right? We saw Bitcoin 20x. We saw the US dollar print trillions and trillions, under Trump. And then we saw, Trump bring in Brian Brooks, Mnuchin, and this whole group. We saw, him sign policy in the OCC to say banks can hold stable coins and hold crypto assets. And we saw all this forward dollar system moves in the public sector. Meanwhile, Trump is tweeting out Bitcoin sucks, the dollar rules, blah, blah, blah. But like his actual actions behind it was, the digitalization of the dollar, and, through stable coins, that was really the action that was happening despite the rhetoric. So I think there's a white pill actually in this weird way, despite spelling out this public sector capture, is that these events are coordinated with the halvings, which I think is important. And again, I literally obviously can't claim COVID is because of the third halving. I mean, that's ridiculous. But I don't know. There's a lot of things that happen that if they want to shut down the velocity of money in a hyperinflationary situation, they know that we're, over our skis. We have to print trillions and trillions of dollars. The reverse repo market implodes September 2019. The Fed sets up these special instruments to sort of, bring liquidity to the repo market. You're starting to see issues in the treasury market. All of a sudden there's a flu, there's a thing shut down, boom, 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 boom. And all these things kind of fall into place. So I'm not really a believer in coincidences anymore, Nico. I think these things sort of generally line up. So here we are. Now it's days after the halving, a week after the halving. It's May Day. And we're seeing all this fucking crazy shit. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence. So, here we are.
One of my favorite quotes, Mark, is there are no conspiracies, but there are also no coincidences. Mm-hmm. And I have no shadow of a doubt the symbolic nature of Roger Ver's arrest,
Sure.
CZ's sentencing the same day, the richest man to have ever gone to prison. Meanwhile, we're getting lectured on basically how the samurai guys broke all these laws. And I don't remember any notable or large or big banker going to jail for what they did in 2008, 2009, even though they did significantly more material damage to the American people, to the world, frankly, than any type of dev writing code. Right, that's utterly absurd. And I tweeted it out a couple days ago. I said, again, to use your word, it's not a coincidence that these arrests are happening around the same time. It is extremely symbolic. And one of the observations that I had, it was last cycle, and Mark, maybe you appreciate this because I don't see enough people talking about it, but the CCP mining ban came in the middle of the parabola of the last bull run. And I would even go on to say that was one of the primary reasons we didn't hit 100K. Like if you take a look at the hash rate and the price, you will literally see the price peaking and the hash rate going down. And of course, all the sell pressure from those miners having to sell Bitcoin, having to sell equipment to relocate to a more favorable jurisdiction, and it kind of created this like double peak. It's like literally clear as day. You see the hash rate, you see the price going down, right? And to your point, do you think a nation state or a government like the CCP, like in the United, they don't have the sophistication to realize that they must attack the price? I mean, there was these leaked documents that were coming out of European regulators that said, we have to do something about the price. We have to do something about the price. So yeah, dude, no way is this a coincidence. It's not only symbolic in nature, but it's on purpose. And there's just been so many actions by the current administration that have been incredibly hostile towards the industry. The proposed 30% tax, I remember the White House came out with the presidential economic report. They dedicated 20 effing pages, bro, to making the case as to why central bank digital currencies are necessary and, Bitcoin is not, right? And do I think it's a coincidence that now the FBI is releasing a so-called tips for citizens, stay away from, unlicensed money transmitters a couple months after the ETFs were approved? No, I don't think that's a coincidence at all. But before I continue my rambling, I think my question to you is, what do Bitcoiners need to do to combat everything that you're talking about, right? So we're seeing this happen in slow motion. It's like kind of this slow motion train. Honestly, I love the guys at BPI. I love David Zell.
Sure.
The guy's at Coin Center, great. Dennis Porter on the state level, he's doing a good job. But it's not enough. Like, I feel like metaphorically, we're getting beat up by a 2x4. They're telling you, listen, you can give up your U.S. citizenship. Doesn't matter. 10 years later, doesn't matter what country you are in the world, we're going to nab you and we're going to put you in a box and we're going to make an example out of you. Right? So we're definitely in the then they fight you stage. What can individual Bitcoiners do?
Yeah, I mean, we've been in the then they fight you stage for a long time. I mean, they've made examples out of our brothers, and these titans, someone like a Julian Assange, for being a journalist, for publishing things, for telling the truth. I think this idea in general, my only issue with, again, and I agree with you, all those people you mentioned, Coin Center, BPI, Mr. Porter, like, I think they're incredibly nice people. And there's a lot of people involved in those things that I really do respect quite a bit. But I think the general idea that we're sort of, and again, this, may be clippable and kind of bad, but like, I just don't think we're really in a rule of law anymore. I'm not sure rule of law is really intact. What the samurai guys did, is not money transmitting. It's not money laundering. I mean, Bitcoin doesn't even really work that way. That's not how the Bitcoin system works. There's no transfers. I mean, it doesn't work in that same way. Bitcoin can't be taxed as property and then be regulated as a money transferring when the regulatory arms pick and choose. It's just not fair in a rule of law, in a land with consistent law. And so I think we have to sort of realize that we're past that, and realize especially too that post-COVID, post-lockdowns, warp speed and these mandates and these things that we're in a world empire context, and the rule of law is dubious at best. And so I think that's the framework we have to kind of understand, that yes, compliance will get you pretty far until it doesn't. And what happens when you can't comply anymore? When they don't let you comply anymore, then you've really lost all of the ground that you maybe could have spent fighting while you were so busy complying and licking boots. And so I'm not calling out any of these organizations at all, because I think we need to attack on all fronts. We need people doing those things. We need people going through the compliance angle. But I think in terms of individuals, it's like, no, we need to kind of stand up and, think about what's happening here. The rule of law is not being, promoted, not being protected. We shouldn't expect it to be. They're changing definitions at a whim when it suits them. And so that's kind of the framework that we have to operate in. So understanding that, we need to make sure that, we keep Bitcoin as permissionless as it was when we found it. I think that's the only responsibility Bitcoiners have to Bitcoin. And that is not really, that's becoming increasingly more difficult as, they're pushing these self-custody solutions, further and further out of the reach of American citizens and of app stores and of, kind of the more traditional, not quite so public squares that people download this software in. And so I think we need to kind of think adversarially and build more sustainable systems that can withstand state sponsored attacks. I think we need to reject the notion that Bitcoin will scale through stable coins. It's fucking ridiculous. It's very clearly a state sponsored mode of discourse that's an option. And that is the way that we should go about it. No, like, Bitcoin is a technology. And like John Nash said, it's technology that we can, tweak and grow and make better and make more efficient for its purposes. It's a technology. So we need to figure out scaling mechanisms that allow billions of people to use it in a self-sovereign, self-custodial, permissionless, censorship-resistant way. I don't think it's appropriate for me, both in terms of my technical lack of knowledge and also my editorial position, that I don't think I should be pushing specific, paths. I don't think it's really appropriate. But whatever it is, I think we need to build those tools and those systems. Of course, use Lightning, use eCash, use these other L2s that are coming up. Consider covenant proposals, and make sure that Bitcoin is ready to to service when fiat. Because let's just be honest. As much as we love Bitcoin, and it's given us so much freedom, if a huge world currency collapsed, and billions of people needed to be onboarded overnight onto the Bitcoin network, that just wouldn't really be possible right now. You couldn't open 1 billion Lightning channels. It would take years at current, channel factory, inability. The creating 1 billion UTXOs would take an incredibly long time. So there's a lot of things that we need to kind of like build infrastructurally, to allow citizens, or not even citizens, but just people, to have access to this, permissionless ledger. So yeah, the attack is coming. The state is here. Bitcoin is for enemies. Our state is the enemy. Bitcoin empowers the individual. And, in a world where corporations are individuals and countries are corporations, therefore countries are individuals. It's like countries and nation states can be empowered by Bitcoin, whether that's, like an El Salvador scenario, or even kind of more maybe like a shadowy US economic hegemon perpetuation, using Bitcoin. So I think we need to think more adversarially. We need to think of Bitcoin as a technology and make sure that we keep it this peer-to-peer, medium of exchange. Make sure we optimize for that, because I can tell that these ghouly goblins want us to look at it as a commodity, look at it as a store of value only, look at it as something that can be ETF'd and reduced to a QSIP, and look at it as something that, they want us to look at it as something that just sits on a balance sheet and appreciates. There's this rhetoric of never spend your Bitcoin, use credit cards or use Tether, and keep your Bitcoin, and it's like, no, Bitcoin's a means to an end. Use it to build a better world. It's that's really what this is for. It's about perpetuating freedom, building more sustainable infrastructure that will allow the individual to thrive, as the state sort of loses its both. Right now the state is a burning ship. I mean, the $34 trillion of debt. The rats are escaping. They're jumping off this burning runaway debt service. It's a zombie company, the United States. You would never invest in it. Its debt service is now outpacing the growth of its GDP. Take it around the back, old Yeller it, right? So people are jumping off and removing themselves from it, and that's why I think there's this big rhetoric shift. Like, we're moving towards the Malays. We're, after a UFC fight, we got Joe Rogan holding a microphone, and we got a guy going, "I love private property." It's like, yeah, they want us to love private property now that they've stolen everything from our grandkids, from our grandparents. That they've looted the treasury. Now they want to push private property and the Austrian school and all these, badass great things. Sure, of course, but like, it serves them now to push us towards this, kind of Malay mindset now that they've looted everything. So they want us to blame the central banks. Fuck the central banks, but fuck the private banks that push the public sector to blow up 2008 and make them too big to fail. It was Greenspan who was at JP Morgan, who wrote the Rethinking Glass-Steagall, who pushed for the dissolving of Glass-Steagall. These guys jumping in and out, private, public, whenever it works for them. They're all kind of in the private sector now. Sitting on their COVID money. Of course now they're pushing this free market capitalism. Malay is talking at Davos, saying how badass capitalism is. It's like, yeah, sure, capitalism is badass, but there's a reason why we're seeing that. You don't see anything by mistake. There's not an accident when you see something. There's a reason why this person is being promoted, and it's because it's useful for them to push us towards cheer on the free market as they tokenize the carbon in your backyard and shove it on a Bitcoin side chain and throw a satellite in space, and they observe you to check on your carbon. And it's Steve Mnuchin and Howie Lutnick, who, is the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, who holds all of Tether's, treasuries. Like, they're running this private sector intelligence company. The CIA has gone private. It's in Palantir now. Like, this is so good. It's so based the free market. Like, not really. Like, fuck all those guys. Fuck Palantir. Fuck Peter Thiel. Fuck Mnuchin. Fuck these guys. They're ghouls that have taken advantage when the public sector has allowed it to accrue massive amounts of wealth, and they're using it as a way to control and observe us and sell our data. Like, I don't think that's based. I don't think what Peter Thiel is doing with Palantir is based at all. Even though I'm a free market capitalist, and I'm not trying to say we should put regulations in to stop it, just like I would never argue we should filter out Tether shoving fucking petrodollars in the witness Merkle of Bitcoin. Like, I don't want to filter that shit either. It's a permissionless system. Let them do it. But we should talk shit about it and say how this is dumb. Let's scale Bitcoin with actual scaling solutions that don't perpetuate the military industrial complex of the United States via the Treasury Ponzi, right? Like, let's do that. So that would be my answer. That's my long-winded answer, is call these fuckers out, and let's make Bitcoin, this ship that can service 8 billion people that need to get out from underneath the encroaching tentacles of the nation state collapsing.
100%, dude. And bro, it's like, I hate saying, what I say is, I say Bitcoin or slavery, right? And I said it very early on, and I think a lot of people interpreted it as this hyperbolic statement. But once you really understand that you really only have two options, right? It's a future of it's a fiat future, it's a Bitcoin future. It's a future of peace, prosperity, optimism, hope, versus a future of nihilism, endless war, slavery, you name it, right? And I think the battle lines are a little bit obfuscated right now. I think people can't really see, the two options ahead of them, but it's clear as day for anyone who's paying attention. And you actually reminded me of something you said, where it's like, we're living in this era of no laws. And actually, and you were mentioning Beauty On earlier, and love Beauty On. What he's doing with the Stecco is amazing. And it reminds me of one of the tweets. I don't know if he originally wrote this, but this comes from his Twitter account. It says, the FBI calls Bitcoin money so they can arrest you for money laundering. The IRS calls it property so they can tax you on capital gains. The SEC calls it a security so they can sue every exchange. And the CFTC calls it a commodity so you can't use it as a currency. So it is a currency when it's convenient to them, when they need it for lawfare. It's not a currency when, it can't be a currency, because if it's a currency, then capital gains, WTF. But I also think that they're in this like pickle, man. Like, they're in this pickle. I think if we get to a point, and the Overton window is shifting, the internet and peer-to-peer mass level communications, brother. Like, your podcast, for example, that you did with Whitney Webb, and you start to see this. It's the slow death of the legacy corporate media and the rise of independent content creators, and it allows people to circumvent the gatekeepers of information. And we're seeing like this great awakening in the process because of that. I think people are starting to question the official party line, and I think most importantly, as Bitcoiners, is to really push this message forward of like, if we get the mainstream consciousness and the mainstream populace to just ask the question, number one, what is money? And number two, why should I be forced to use a money that steals from me? Like, they don't have a good answer for that. Like, they don't have one. You see them struggling, trying to justify the CBDCs with, we need more efficient payments. Like, they completely ignore the inflation aspect side of things. So, like, I hear you, and I think we have a tremendous amount of work to do, education. But I also think that by the day, more and more people join our ranks. What would you say about that?
I totally agree. Absolutely. I think the sort of false dichotomies that's been presented to us, if you're really still buying that up and lapping that up after COVID, I think there's really something wrong with your perception. No offense. If you really are buying the red versus blue, we watched the 180 phase shift happen where Trump was pushing the vaccines. And then 3 months later, I was in the Bay. I chose not to get vaccinated. I'm being called a Trumper because I didn't want to get vaccinated. And it's like, what? How did we get here? What happened? I don't even understand this. Like Kamala was saying she didn't want to take the vaccine because it's Trump's vaccine. And now I'm a Trump. I mean, it's just the phase shifts are happening so fast. The cycles are compressing so fast that, yeah, maybe you didn't quite get that everything was fucked up after 9/11. Maybe you didn't quite get everything was fucked up after 2008. But COVID was a really quick turnaround. And I think that, our generation, we're so hyper connected. There's so much information being exchanged that you're right. There's a huge opportunity to gain inroads into the consciousness of, because I think humans are really they're a social group. There is a mass consciousness, and I think there's a huge opportunity now for Bitcoiners, for freedom loving people, to stand up for the truth and perpetuate this idea that Bitcoin is a means to an end for a better world. And how do we actualize that? But I do think there's also some danger in the internet and the hyperconnectivity. And there's a lot of co-option within, the counter narrative as well. Also something I noticed with COVID, I think at this point, maybe I'll get roasted for this, but at this point, I kind of see a lot of the vaccine discourse as basically just being a distraction from the fact that they shut down the fucking country and told us that we couldn't walk around and do stuff. So we're all worrying about clots and this and blah 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 and whatever. It's no one even cares that they literally locked us in our homes and destroyed the working class.
It was nuts.
And so much of the discourse from that was so controlled and dumb. And now we're learning like, oh man, a lot of that was actually kind of paid by these sort of private, intelligence. And so we're seeing, the great example, not to tie it always back to Tether, but who took Rumble public? It was Cantor Fitzgerald. It was our boy Howie Lutnick taking Rumble public, who's a huge investor in Rumble, Peter Thiel. He's dabbling on both sides here. And so there is this huge controlled narrative also on the alternative side. Of course, no one trusts mainstream media anymore, but I think it's pretty easy to buy a podcast. It's pretty easy to buy a company, a Bitcoin company. It's pretty easy to tetherize a Bitcoin company, right? And so much discourse in the Bitcoin space is sponsored by the U.S. Treasury system via Tether, which is just something that needs to be talked about. Doesn't mean they're bad people. Doesn't mean that everything they say is a lie or whatever, but they're not going to go as hard at a Tether or something, if that's who's paying their paycheck, right?
And you're burying the lead there a little bit, because I think not that many people are aware of what you just said, right? The fact that Tether is one of the largest U.S. Treasury holders. I think
Totally.
they just posted their profits. I think they made like 4.7 billion or something like that.
Yeah. They have 110 plus $1 billion of treasuries. Like China is like barely over $1 trillion.
Yeah.
So they're at like 1/10 of China. Already? What? Think about that, guys. Think about that.
It's pretty crazy. So, Mark, I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned, you said they. Who is they? Like, who is this cartel? Like, who is this?
Yeah.
I'm using Andreas's words when I say cartel here.
Sure.
Who is this cartel? Who is this cabal of people that is pulling the strings?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm not necessarily here to name specific names. I like to look at mechanisms, and I think mechanisms are more important. I wrote the Bitcoin dollar basically not naming any names. Obviously had to list a couple companies, but I don't think Paolo's name is even in that book, right? and nothing personal against Paulo. Again, it's about the mechanisms. And I think that's how we have to really look at this stuff. It's who's building the mechanisms, who's encouraging stable coins on Lightning, who's building these things. And those are the kind of, you begin to kind of follow that money, and I got Joe Rogers, our boy, friend of the show, friend of all of ours, hooked me up with a Crunchbase account, and I'm going through looking at fucking every single VC seed raised fund, everything of all of these companies, and you start to piece together this kind of cartel of people that have really infiltrated the Bitcoin space, the crypto space. And you start to see this tokenized ink take form, this dollarization ink take form. And I think, unfortunately, a big part of this group is directly connected with what is known as the PayPal Mafia. And I think you start to look at PayPal and these players and who's, the big shakers in scene now. And a lot of them can be connected back to PayPal. So, like someone like Reid Hoffman, who's a PayPal OG. He was, the founder of LinkedIn. It's kind of wild. A lot of these PayPal guys, became billionaires like multiple times. They hit gold multiple times in a row. Kind of interesting. And someone like him. So, he invests. He's the lead of the Series A, the seed round for Blockstream in November 2014. Well, then October 2014, Blockstream releases a paper that basically explains how sidechains work. And that, basically allows them to, put other assets onto Bitcoin and create this peg mechanism. Kind of interesting. You look at, who was, these early founders of PayPal. You look at this guy. There's this guy with Bill Elkis, who was one of the main founders of PayPal. In 97, he was the co-signee of the J. Epstein Foundation. And then he goes on to form Clearstone with William Quigley, which is another VC firm who considers himself one of the co-founders of Tether. You look at Howie Lutnick. He's buying assets, real estate assets, off of the Epstein estate. He owns, I believe, 1171st East Street. Epstein owned 9, and the fund was that he bought it from, Comet Trust, was connected with Guido Goldman and Wexner, and all these guys kind of connected to this cabal. They're all, Reid Hoffman is an Epstein guy. Obviously Peter Thiel and Elon, and you kind of start to see these guys that, what was Epstein really? Everyone focuses on the trafficking, and sure, he did that, but he was kind of an economic hitman. And he was a big part of a lot of the things that happened in 08, and was kind of bopping around doing, running some estate stuff for the Bronfmans. And then you look at the Bronfmans, they're directly connected with this group Endeavor, which is sort of this like kind of, an advisory group that's all over, Mercado Libre, which is the biggest market in South America, with Zappa, with Wences Casares, who was kind of the patient zero of Silicon Valley for Bitcoin. He brought Bitcoin to all of these guys. These guys. So you start to kind of piece together the money, you follow the money, and you start to see a web of these people that are directly connected to some of the spookiest people around. A lot of these guys are, building satellite companies and doing all this crazy shit in South America, in Argentina. That was the piece that we just wrote, Debt from Above. It kind of focuses on this satellite company. That's Howie Lutnick and Mnuchin, General Dunford, who was the chief of staff under Trump, Marcos Galperin, who's the richest man in Argentina, an Endeavor guy who runs Mercado Libre, and then Howie Lutnick. So you're beginning to kind of see these connections. You're seeing Larry Summers on the board of Zappo, and he was a big part of the, dissolving of Glass-Steagall in the United States. You just start to see all this stuff. It's very hard to ignore. So I think that there is a cartel there. There is sort of this dollar system, private sector cabal that has been sort of pushing things from behind the scene for a really long time. You look at, a dozen times in the 90s as a new trade agreement is happening, which ends up kind of blowing up the Mexican peso. Who does the George Soros thing and shorts the peso all the way down? It's Joe Lewis. Who's Joe Lewis? He's the Deltec guy who's the banker for Tether. You start to see all these connections, this kind of conspiracy all comes together. Yeah, there's some shady stuff going on in the dollar system, in Bitcoin, in some of the Bitcoin infrastructure, in the stablecoin infrastructure, their bankers. Yeah, I mean, that's to my best, hours and hours of poring over these things, looking at all these Series A's, Series B's, like going through the portfolios of all these people. I like to just do kind of all public information, kind of open source intelligence stuff, because it's much safer. And you get in less trouble because you're not speculating as much. I think people sometimes accuse our work of being doom pilled and just loose associations and all this, but it's like, well, they're not really that loose associations. I think they're pretty direct. So like, no, I don't think that there's like a weekly Tuesday meeting where all these guys get together and then they say, okay, 3 weeks out from the halving, okay, let's get ready to charge Samurai. Like, I don't think it's directly that. I think it's a lot more, people operating. Some of them are willing, some of them are unwilling. I think it's a whole smattering of things. I think that's how a lot of these kind of societies and cabals kind of work, that there's someone who knows what's going on, but most of the agents don't. So I think we're kind of in that zone where you can only really begin to see the sketching out of the cabal, the cartel, whatever you want to call it, when you really zoom out. So there's a lot to look there, but I would tell people to look at the PayPal Mafia, look at these guys, look at all the things that they've done, all their VC firms, and how they've really integrated, from Goldman and Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan, and that, they've really digitized the dollar, and really created these information networks. All these guys have moved on to LinkedIn and Kiva and these other product X, right? These other products that are really networks more than kind of anything. Palantir is a they sell data to the government, right? It's like, so there's obviously a great power in data. And so many of these guys have understood that. And you start to look into the the cartel behind the data markets. I just did a piece on that for the last magazine called Random Access Markets. That's all about data markets. And you get some really spooky stuff. The Maxwell sisters, Ghislaine Maxwell sisters, were like some of the biggest proponents of early internet search engines. Magellan was a Christine Maxwell project. And you start to see this connection, unfortunately. And so information runs the world just as much as dollars. And information, it's kind of like a Web3 talking point, but it's the new oil. It's like, well, it kind of always was. That's how they control people, right? That's why these blackmail schemes exist. It's to catch you in a compromising place so they can control you, not because they want you to be doing nefarious, gross stuff. It's so they can control you. That's why we're seeing the Diddy shit. That's why we're seeing this crap. It's about control. So how do you control people? How do you create a cartel? Well, if you get a group of people that are controlled from the very beginning, like say maybe a PayPal Mafia, and then you use these same players for 3 decades, that's maybe how we get in the situation that we're in. So I would say look there.
Absolutely, man. This is fascinating stuff. So fascinating. Guys, go check out Mark's writing. This is I can't imagine how deep this rabbit hole goes, but it seems like you're connecting the dots, and yeah, it's just interesting. Anyways, so we did have a really interesting question from the audience, and I do want to ask you that last, because we are getting very close to the top of the hour. But higher calling was wondering if you thought that they could pull off their plan. And he commented that Whitney seems to think that there is a real chance. And then lastly, this kind of goes against a lot of the theory from a lot of Bitcoiners, which is, like Saifedean, for example. Love the guy, super great writer, enjoyed his works. But, he believes that Bitcoin has already won, right? We've heard this many, many times. So where are you on that camp?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what you mean by one, right? I mean, I think Bitcoin is inevitable. I think that it's here to stay.
Let me interrupt you and let me rephrase the question.
Sure.
Will Bitcoin enable the separation of money and state?
Okay, that's a much better question. With all due respect to your first question, which was also a good question, but that's a much better question. I don't know. I think this is a time frame based question. And this is something that, CK, longtime Epic Bitcoin magazine guy who brought me in, he has this philosophy that everything is good for Bitcoin. And I think on long enough time frames, that's probably true. Like an ETF probably is good for Bitcoin, long term. But I think short and medium term, it could potentially be very, very bad. And I think that there's a lot of ways that Bitcoin can monetize like that. It kind of depends on what your metrics for success. So if the metrics of success is separating, money and state, well, depending on the axioms of that, it has already won. I think, if we look at, the monetary policy landmarks of the halving, being right around these humongous geopolitical macro events, I think you could argue that the economic policy of Bitcoin is already a world changing, certainly country changing, the events. So in that sense, yes, I think, the new kind of, federal funding rate or whatever, the new interest rate, in many ways you could say is the issuance of Bitcoin, the block reward, which I think is a state change of money, no pun intended. And I think that's important. But can the dollar system use Bitcoin in the same way they used oil as a way to increase dollar demand and perpetuate the US dollar system another 80 years? Absolutely they can. And I think when you're seeing, 1 million or so Bitcoin, within the borders of the United States, whether through DOJ seizures or MicroStrategy or the ETFs, that can be seized basically by the United States government, almost inevitably seized by the United States government or already seized by the US government. This idea of Bitcoin being unseizable money, I think is sort of a joke when it has been seized, 1 million times or whatever, right? Yes, I understand that's not how cryptography works, yada, yada, but also we have seen it. We have seen the US government, seize funds. So it is possible.
It's like I think a lot of people have the conception where it's like they're going to seize it the way that they seize money, but they forget that human beings operate in meat space. And you put up a human being, you break down their door, show up with a bunch of guns, put a gun in your face. And what are you going to do? You're most likely going to hand over the keys, right?
Absolutely. We talk big games, and I think there's a lot of badass Bitcoiners that probably would start blasting, and fuck yeah, dude. I mean, not that I'm condoning. I'm not condoning on video, attacking law enforcement. I'm not saying that. I just want to be very clear to the YouTube gods. I'm not saying that. But hey, there are people that will put their money where their mouth is and their blood where their mouths are and defend Bitcoin. But I think a lot of people, that's not what they're in here for. And so if the situation gets presented where they go, hey, we're going to shove you onto this Bitcoin side chain where you get an IOU, but we let you keep your limbs, you still want $1 million. Those people are going to go do it. I think the majority of Bitcoiners will do that. That's sort of how they'll win. They'll dangle this thing and kind of get us to, hey, you want all the carbon credits that are offset by the forest in your backyard. All you got to do is get this digital ID and sign up to this blockchain, and we'll give you $133,000 because of your forest. people are going to do that because they're going to be like, well, fuck yeah, I don't have anything else. And then where do those land rights go? Where do the world is going to end in like unread user agreements. That's going to kind of be that's the apocalypse here. So I think Bitcoin in many ways can monetize to millions and millions of dollars, and not actually increase the day-to-day freedom of most people. I think that there will be a lot of us that will, have increased purchasing power in the short term before things get kind of crazy. And this is why I think this is kind of the most important time in Bitcoin sort of ever. We're getting split between the state, anti-state, compliance, degeneracy. And I think we need to kind of lean into anti-state, lean into degeneracy, and build these tools.
Lean into freedom, bro. Freedom,
exactly.
Right? Lean into
Absolutely.
freedom.
Yeah. And our enemy is not, again, and not to get preachy, because I think a lot of the ordinal stuff is really dumb, but like our enemy is not a guy in a Pepe hat who is throwing some fucking stupid gifts on fucking Bitcoin. That's not our enemy. Our enemy is the state and the U.S. Treasury system. So let's like remember who it is, and let's not cheer on the arrests of our brothers and the encroachment of the state. And let's remember who the enemy is here. And let's hopefully have Bitcoin be a means to an end for freedom for individuals. And I think we can win. I do think that they'll do some damn good damage with their fucking plans. But I believe in humans. I believe good comes together in the end. I believe good is coming together. I believe people are more aware of this shit than ever. And I do think in a lot of ways they are scrambling too. Like I think these are plans they've had for decades, but I also think they've made some big mistakes. And maybe their biggest mistake was letting people like myself and yourself and Opti and our friends, get a little scratch and put together a little something, and we get to build a little thing where we get to fight back. And maybe that was their biggest mistake. But it's only a mistake if we use it wisely. So that I guess I'll leave it on that.
Opti put in the chat. Absolute bars. Yes, 100%. The state was not ready for the internet and all the things that came with it, even though they were responsible for developing a lot of it. But they didn't realize the Pandora's box that they opened. The Pandora's box for freedom, which I think is a good thing. Anyways, Mark Goodwin, it's been an absolute honor, an absolute pleasure to have you on Simply Bitcoin IRL for the first time. Hope to see you in Nashville for the Bitcoin 2024 conference. Really, really excited for that. And it'd be an honor to have you on again in a couple months or so. So thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.
Anytime, man. Thank you guys. I love what you guys are doing. Stay free, do your thing, and definitely see you in Nashville. And check out writings at Bitcoin Magazine. Check out the print mag, what Joe and AB does there. Just incredible. Check out the Bitcoin Dollar book. And I guess see my schizo posting on Twitter. And we'll see you out there for sure. We need you. Fight like hell.
Appreciate it, man. Yeah, dude. Honored to be in the trenches with you. Man, this is that was an incredible podcast, incredible episode. Highly enjoyed it. Mark dropping the hot fire. Anyways, guys, see you tomorrow for another episode of Simply Bitcoin Live, and peace out, everybody.